Greetings and welcome to this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. My name is Joe Rubenstein and it is Thursday, September 13th, and the Yankees showed no sign of a pulse whatsoever last night as they sleepwalked their way through the road trip finale in Minnesota, dropping the game and the series to the sub-500 Twins, managing just a single hit as they finish a losing road trip, and their lead over the Oakland A's for that top wildcard spot now stands at a single game as this ball club continues to stumble its way through a summer of sustained mediocrity and boring, listless baseball. After the game, manager Aaron Boone had this to say, quote, "Baseball will punch you in the mouth now and then," unquote. Right, because that's what we need here. That's what's really called for, right? More cliches, more two-bit philosophy. I mean, this team looks like the Walking Dead, and this guy just doesn't have a clue. You can follow us on Twitter, @BombersPodcast is the handle. You can also send us questions. We'll try to answer each and every week in our mailbag segment here on the podcast. You can like us on Facebook, subscribe to our show on iTunes or Stitcher. We're on Spotify as well, or give us a call, 646-854-4959. And as always, you can send your comments and questions to joe@BronxBombersPodcast.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. Coming up a little bit later on in our Twitter poll this week, some interesting results when we asked if the Yankees should acquire a catcher this offseason to compete with Gary Sanchez for the starting job. And I'll answer a fascinating question from one of our followers about whether the Yankees should re-sign Sabathia Gardner this offseason. Also, he's the editor-in-chief of EliteSportsNY.com. Danny Small rejoins the show for a wide-ranging conversation you will not want to miss. Mostly Yankees, but a little Jets and Giants as well. And we'll take a look back and revisit the final 2 months of the Yankees' 2000 championship season. All that and more coming up on today's Bronx Bombers. Back in a moment.
Bronx Bombers trivia. Which of these 4 players did Derek Jeter replace in 1996 to become the regular Yankee shortstop? Was it A, Andy Fox, B, Pat Kelly, C, Alvaro Espinosa, or D, Tony Fernandez? The answer coming up a little bit later in the podcast.
And now here's Joe with this week's main thing.
So it's been a while since we've gone historical on this podcast. We did a lot of it during the winter, but since the season started, it's been pretty much all about the unfolding action. But today I'd like to step away from the present momentarily and dedicate this segment to all those people, myself very much included, who have looked at the inconsistency and at times downright mediocrity of this team all summer and concluded that a championship title in 2018 is not to be. And I'm calling this segment Remember 2000. So let's take a look back. 18 years ago today, the Yankees, with 2 consecutive World Series titles under their belt and 3 out of the last 4, dropped the final game of a 3-game series against the Blue Jays. The Jays started none other than David Wells in that game. Wells, just a little over 2 years earlier, had of course pitched a perfect game in pinstripes at the stadium. For 8 innings against the Blue Jays on that September evening in the Bronx, Andy Pettitte pitched well, but Jose Cruz Jr. ripped a 2-run homer off of rookie reliever Randy Choate in the 11th, and Toronto was indeed victorious, but there wasn't too much concern, at least not yet, for manager Joe Torre as the Yankees headed into a 4-game series against the Indians. The Bombers at that point led the American League East by 8 games over the Red Sox, and their pitching had been solid all summer. But the home opener against Cleveland was humbling indeed, as the Yankees were absolutely demolished by a score of 11-1, and David Cone, in his first start since dislocating his left shoulder 10 days earlier, gave up 9 hits, 4 walks, and 6 runs. To make matters worse, Paul O'Neill, who would retire after the following season, injured his right hip chasing a fly ball, and the Yankees were already banged up. Bernie Williams had a ribcage strain and was sitting it out. Tino Martinez had a sore left elbow. And Chuck Knobloch, our leadoff hitter that year, who had dealt with throwing jitters all year, including a game in June against the White Sox when he had 3 errors and walked out of the game and the stadium, was having elbow elbow pain, possibly because he'd started throwing to first base sidearmed to cure his yips, which in fact would never be cured. But by the end of the Indians series, there was concern in Yankee Nation as the Bombers had dropped 3 out of the 4 games, the penultimate loss by a score of 15-4 as starter Denny Nagel lasted just 2 1/3 innings, and in that same game Jose Canseco, who was replacing the injured Paul O'Neill, turned right field into a veritable disaster zone. After he fumbled a hit in the 3rd inning as it caromed off of a wall for his first error, he allowed an easy fly ball to drop for his second, and the bleacher creatures let him have it, booing him heavily. The final game of that series was closer, but a loss is a loss, and the Yankees were shut out 2-0 as 25-year-old Indian starter Bartolo Colon hit triple digits on the radar gun. The Yankees actually barely avoided being no-hit in that game in the 8th inning when Luis Polonia, the only Yankee not to strike out that night, shot a ball up the middle for a single. To finish his masterpiece with a flourish, Colon struck out the side, and Yankee starter Roger Clemens took his first loss since June 9th, despite striking out 9. After the game, catcher Jorge Posada expressed real concern about the Yankees' play of late, saying, quote, "We're not focused right now. We've got to find a way to clinch and have some fun. We're not having fun," unquote. But on September 19th, the Yankees' magic number remained at 8 as they boarded the team plane and headed to Toronto to face once again the mediocre third-place Blue Jays. And concern rapidly transformed to out-and-out worry as the Bombers were absolutely humiliated in that first game against the Blue Jays by a score of 16-3. They embarrassed themselves in the field with stunningly bad defense, and Pettit and the bullpen were equally atrocious, allowing 19 hits. As Torre said after the game, quote, "Just ugly, really ugly, and we have to do something about it. Manager, coaches, players, all bad," unquote. A grim-faced Derek Jeter concurred, saying, quote, "We're playing terrible, and that's the bottom line. No hitting, no pitching, no defense," unquote. Bernie Williams called it a wake-up call. But there would be no waking from this nightmare, not for a while yet, as the following day the Yankees were again handled by a score of 7-2 as the Blue Jays tore into totally ineffective starter David Cone, whose velocity was way down. Cone gave up 6 hits, 2 walks, and 7 runs before being knocked out in the 4th, resulting in the Yankees' 6th loss in 7 games. The New York Times headline read, "Yankees free fall grows, and it's also growing serious." The offense was sputtering, Tino Martinez hitless in his last 21 at-bats, and Scott Brocious and Bernie Williams were also mired in serious slumps. But in baseball, there's always tomorrow. Except for the Yankees, tomorrow brought even more misery as the Jays completed the sweep with a 3-1 victory, and the Yankees fell once again to their old friend David Wells, who pitched a complete game, striking out 8 and walking none. Asked for his thoughts about the Yankees from his vantage point in the opposing dugout and on the mound over the last 2 series, Wells would say after the game, quote, "I see a good ball club over there, but they're very beatable. They're definitely not the same team they were from 1996 to 99, unquote. The hitting had been atrocious, the team batting just .197 in their last 9 games, outscored 60-18 in that stretch. But the Yankees could perhaps take some solace in their next opponent, the hapless Detroit Tigers, currently sitting 16 games behind the White Sox in the American League Central, but the horror show simply would not end as the Bombers, back in the Bronx, fell 9-6 in the opener against the Tigers, and Detroit starter Hideo Nomo managed to strike out 8 Yankees in just the first 3 innings. The Yankees had not held a lead in a game in a week, and at 6 straight defeats now, it was their longest losing streak in 3 years. Commented Jack Curry in the Times, quote, "They're not even crawling toward the postseason. They have stopped dead in their tracks at the worst possible time. Their offense has disappeared," unquote. The next 48 hours brought a brief respite as the Yankees somehow managed to string together a pair of wins, but again, they looked totally listless in the series finale when they were destroyed by the normally punchless Tigers 15-4 as Yankees starter Dwight Gooden, who'd been pondering retirement all year, completely unraveled on the mound, and David Cone, who'd been moved to the bullpen after his previous disaster against Toronto, came on in relief and performed just as badly, yielding 5 runs on 6 hits. Together, the two former Cy Young winners gave up 9 runs on 11 hits, 5 walks, 1 wild pitch, and just 1 strikeout. The only 2 bright spots were Jeter and David Justice. Jeter's infield single in the 5th was the 1,000th hit of his career, and Justice slammed his career-best 41st home run in the 4th inning, his 20th bomb since the Yankees acquired him from Cleveland mid-season. And so, on to Tampa and the last-place Devil Rays, a team currently sitting 23 games under 500. If ever a team needed a cupcake like this, it was the New York Yankees, but this cupcake was laced with arsenic. The 2 best things that could be said about the Game 1 loss were number 1, it ended, and number 2, it wasn't as remotely as humiliating as the 2 which followed. Posada managed to tie that first game in the top of the 9th with a solo home run, but in the bottom of the frame, Jeff Nelson walked Randy Winn, and then after Mike Stanton came on to replace him, Fred McGriff singled in Winn for the walk-off, and the Yankees now stood in jeopardy of losing home field advantage to either Seattle or Oakland in the first round of next week's playoffs. The next game in Tampa, disaster. The Yankees' magic number remained frozen at 1 as the last-place Rays utterly demolished starter Denny Nagel. The Yankees' 5th loss in the last 2 weeks by 10 or more runs, their 3rd straight defeat, and their 11th loss in 14 games. Said the New York Times, quote, George Steinbrenner lives in the Tampa area, and within the Yankees organization it is widely accepted that beating the Devil Rays is only slightly less important than winning the World Series and world peace, unquote. And the boss would personally attend the concluding game of that series only to witness another demolishment, at least until he stalked out of his private suite in the 8th inning as the pitiful Rays would for the 2nd consecutive day score 11 runs, 6 of them off of Yankee ace Roger Clemens. After this latest fiasco, words like embarrassing, humiliating, even disgusting were muttered in the quiet Yankees clubhouse. The magic number, as it had for days, remained at 1, so on to Baltimore for the final 3-game series of the season against a team only slightly less atrocious than the Devil Rays, as the O's would end the season 14 games under 500, 13.5 back of the Yankees. And whatever was to happen in the series opener in Baltimore could not be worse than back-to-back spankings where the opposition had scored 11. Could it? Indeed, it could. The final score on Friday, September 29th, 2000, 13-2, Baltimore. Ironically, because Boston lost to Tampa that night, the Yankees had made it into the postseason, but after the game, the players filed quietly past the boxes of champagne without picking up a bottle. Torre gave a short speech trying to keep it positive, reminding his players that their ultimate goal was still in their grasp, and then a few players, led by Jeff Nelson, popped the bubbly, but it was a muted celebration at best. As the New York Times remarked, quote, their offense needs a jump start, their middle relief is battered, and most of their projected playoff rotation got hammered this week. The Yankees have come back from adversity before to win, in 1996, in the ALCS in 1998, from the personal problems that ravaged the team in 1999, but this is different. This is fundamental. They are playing horribly, unquote. The next day, Torre rested many of his regular players, and so this 9-1 loss was a little more excusable, but it wasn't exactly a pick-me-up, and the loss was far from meaningless. In fact, it ensured the Yankees that they would begin the postseason on the road where they had been horrible of late. But with the next day's loss, their 7th in a row, in which El Duque was hammered, the season was mercifully done, and the postseason picture finally clarified. In the American League, it would be the Yankees on the road against Oakland, against whom the Bombers had lost 15 of their last 18 games, and Seattle would play at Chicago. In the National League, it would be the Mets, who also struggled in September, at San Francisco, and the Braves at St. Louis. For the Yankees, the division series was an up-and-down affair with flashes of brilliance alternating with reminders of their putrid September. After dropping the opener in Oakland with Roger Clemens on the mound, the Yankees rebounded in Game 2 with stopper Andy Pettitte shutting out the A's 4-zip. They won again in the Bronx in Game 3, but got demolished in Game 4 11-1, and then in the finale in Oakland on the same night that the Mets clinched their series against the Giants, the Yankees scored 6 runs in the first inning, quickly making A's third baseman Eric Chavez eat his ill-advised pre-game words. Before the game, Chavez had fielded questions from the media, but what he didn't know was that his image was being projected on the 2 giant scoreboards over Network Associates Coliseum, and that his words were echoing throughout the ballpark where the Yankees were currently taking batting practice. And the Bombers were all ears as Chavez was asked for his thoughts on the possible end of the Yankees dynasty. Speaking almost as if it was a foregone conclusion, Chavez said, quote, "I don't mind at all. I mean, they've won enough times. It's time for some other people to have some glory," unquote. On the field, Derek Jeter, Paul O'Neill, and others stared up at the third baseman's 30-foot smile as the 22-year-old Chavez, with just 2 years in the bigs under his belt, continued prattling away, saying, quote, "You know what? They've had a great run, but it's hard to stay number 1. Everybody's gunning for you," unquote. The Yankees were incredulous. Said Scott Brocious, quote, "So he's dropping the past tense on us, is he? Did you see that? Well, we'll see how it goes," unquote. And it went as Chuck Knobloch smashed starter Gil Heredia's first pitch for a single to right, Jeter walked, and O'Neill bounced a high infield single. Bases loaded, nobody out. Bernie lined to right, Knobloch scored on the sac fly, and after Heredia walked David Justice, Tino launched a high drive to the base of the center field wall as outfielder Terrence Long was fooled by the sun. Heredia was done for the day, and 8 innings later, so was Oakland, as the Yankees popped champagne and turned their thoughts to the ALCS against the Seattle Mariners. That series was yet another up-and-down affair, as once again the Yankees dropped the first game, this time at home, their offense shackled and shut out by Seattle starter Freddie Garcia, final score 2-zip. But the following day, the offense exploded for 7 runs, and the Yankees took the next 2 games in Seattle as well. In Game 5, Lou Piniella's Mariners made the series a little more interesting, beating Denny Nagel 6-2, but in Game 6, the Yankees, back in the Bronx, treated their fans to a comeback for the ages, winning their 37th pennant by a score of 9-7. Trailing the Mariners 4-3 in the 7th and facing a potential do-or-die Game 7, David Justice smashed a 3-run home run into the right field seats as Yankee fans began chanting, "We want the Mets," the Mets having made short work of the Cardinals in the NLCS. But all year, nothing had come easy for this team, and with the Yankees leading 9-4, the Mariners suddenly hit the gas as their young phenom Alex Rodriguez led off the 8th inning with a home run, knocking El Duque out of the game. Amazingly, even after the always reliable Mariano Rivera came on, Seattle continued to cut into the Yankees' lead, with Mark McLemore ripping a 2-run double off the Yankees closer, and suddenly it was 9-7. In the bottom of the 9th, Rivera again took the mound and managed to retire the first 2 batters, but A-Rod beat out an infield single, and Yankee fans' hearts skipped a beat as up came one of the few hitters in the American League who had Rivera's number, the fearsome Edgar Martinez, representing the tying run. But not to worry, one fastball was all it took, as Martinez dribbled it to Jeter, who rushed in and fired it to Tino at first, and as Tino stepped on the bag to secure the pennant, Jeter leapt into the air, Posada hugged Mariano, and the New York Yankees, after one of the worst late-season slumps in years, were once again headed to the World Series against the Mets, no less. Despite the fact that the first Subway Series since 1956 would last only 5 games, each of those 5 games were incredibly tense, with the first, in the Bronx, the tightest of all. It would last over 5 hours, the longest World Series game by time in history, and it was no beauty. It was filled with base-running blunders, heart-stopping comebacks, and blown rallies. One of those base-running blunders was committed by Mets rookie Timo Perez in the top of the 6th when he failed to run hard on what he thought, incorrectly, was a Todd Zeile home run, and he was thrown out at home plate for the final out of that half of the inning. Earlier in the game, both Todd Zeile and Jay Payton of the Mets Mets had failed to run out rolling balls that stayed fair, and to add insult to injury for Mets fans, Mike Piazza was picked off first. In the bottom of the 6th, David Justice hit a 2-run double, breaking the scoreless tie, but in the 7th, the Mets would storm right back, loading the bases against Andy Pettitte with 1 out, and then scoring 2 on Bubba Trammell's single to left. After a sacrifice bunt by base-running miscreant Timo Perez moved up the runners, Jeff Nelson relieved Pettitte and allowed an RBI single to Edgardo Alfonso to put the Mets on top 3-2. But the Yankees would tie it in the 9th when Knobloch hit a bases-loaded sac fly off Armando Benitez, and later in the 12th, Jose Vizcaíno drove in Tino for the walk-off against Mets reliever Turk Wendell, and Game 1 was in the books with the Yankees on top. Game 2 is mostly remembered for Roger Clemens temporarily losing his mind and throwing the sharp edge of a shattered bat at Mike Piazza, resulting in the bench's clearing, but it was another tightly contested win for the Bombers, this one by the score of 6-5. Game 3 at Shea resulted in the first Yankees loss in a World Series game since 1996, halting their series win streak at 14 games. The following day, the series truly hung in the balance. A Mets victory would knot it at 2, but a Yankees victory would place momentum squarely in their grasp. Derek Jeter would capture that momentum right out of the gate, hitting the very first pitch from Bobby Jones way back into Shea's left field bleachers, just the 16th leadoff home run in World Series history, and a homer which extended Jeter's personal World Series hit streak to 13 games. In the second, Paul O'Neill tripled and scored on a Brocious sac fly, and in the third, Jeter would triple as well, scoring on Luis Sojo's groundout. But the Mets made it interesting in the bottom half of the frame as Mike Piazza slammed a 2-run bomb off of Yankee starter Denny Nagel. But there the scoring would stop as the Yankees hung on and took a stranglehold on the series heading into Game 5 in Queens the very next day. In Game 5, Bernie Williams drew first blood with a solo home run in the second, but the Mets struck right back in the bottom half of the frame, which featured a rare fielding error by Andy Pettitte. With runners on second and third and 2 outs, Pettitte misplayed pitcher Al Leiter's bunt, allowing the Mets to tie it, and then Benny Agbayani's RBI single gave the Mets the lead, which they would hold until the top of the 6th when Jeter, who would be named Series MVP, tied it with a solo home run. That tie stood until the 9th when Mets manager Bobby Valentine made a decision that would be hotly debated in the days to come. Mets ace Al Leiter had remained on the mound, but his pitch count was approaching 140. Nevertheless, Valentine insisted on keeping him in, stating he would live or die with Al Leiter. Valentine's decision seemed to pay off initially, with the big left-hander striking out both Tino Martinez and Paul O'Neill. But then, trouble, as Leiter walked Posada and gave up a single to Brocious. Then another single from Luis Sojo, and sadly for the Mets, center fielder Jay Payton's throw hit Posada as he was sliding into home plate, and the ball ricocheted into the Yankees' dugout, allowing Brocious to score as well and Sojo to take third base. Yankees up 4-2. More drama in the bottom of the 9th as Mike Piazza, with a man on base, came to the plate as a potential tying run, facing Mariano Rivera on the mound. With a loud crack, the ball flew off Piazza's bat to the deepest part of the ballpark. After the game, Torre would say, quote, "It was probably the most scared I've been in a game when Mike hit that ball. I screamed, because any time he hits a ball in the air, it's a home run in my mind. But then I saw Bernie trotting over for it, and I said, wow, I guess I misread that one," unquote. He did indeed, as Bernie Williams, who would later say he knew he had it all the time, calmly gloved the ball just as the clock struck midnight, and the New York Yankees, who by their own admission had embarrassed themselves throughout September against some of the worst teams in the American League, were the champions of baseball once again. It was the final World Series game ever played at Shea Stadium, and no Major League team since then has won consecutive World Series. So, in conclusion, while I'm always happy, more than happy, to revisit Yankee championships, my point here in recounting this, this one in particular, the final 2 months of the 2000 season, is simple, and I won't labor it. If you get into the postseason, no matter how badly you've played in the regular season, even to the very last days, and look, the 2000 Yankees, if you look at their season, struggled far more that year, far more than this current team has this year. If you get in, anything can happen in the playoffs. So no matter what happened in 2018 up till now, or what happens for the rest of this month, remember 2000, my friends, and keep hope alive until the last out is made. Back in a moment. We are joined this week once again by our friend Danny Small, editor-in-chief and writer for EliteSportsNY.com. Just a great site with in-depth coverage of all the New York teams. Highly recommend it. And Danny, it's great having you back on the show. How are you?
I'm doing good. It's good to be back on here. Good to be talking a little Yanks, and definitely an exciting part of the season. So I'm happy and excited to get into it.
So, Danny, we've seen some truly spectacular performances from J. Happ as a Yankee. Most recently, 6 scoreless innings on Monday night in Minnesota. Overall in pinstripes, he's pitched 46 innings, 2.70 ERA, 1.007 WHIP, just 9 walks in 46 innings. That walk total is phenomenal and something that we have not seen from the rest of the staff. And looking ahead to the offseason, I mean, yeah, he turns 36 in October, but he's not a power pitcher. He's a control guy, and those guys can often age better. So, Danny, given how well he's performed, if you're Brian Cashman, do you sign him to a 2 or even a 3-year deal this winter, if that's what he wants, considering the fact that we're probably going to have to fill 3 spots in our rotation?
I think 3 years is a little much. I don't see him getting that from Cashman. I think this past offseason we saw how hesitant GMs and teams were to give those longer contracts to guys. I think that's why we didn't really see a whole lot going on this offseason until right before spring training. I could possibly see a 2-year deal, especially with the way Happ is pitching. He's been everything you could have wanted and more since they traded for him. But I think if the Yankees could convince him maybe to take a 1-year deal, they're going to be good again. They're going to have championship World Series aspirations. If they can convince him to stick around, I think they'd love to do a 1-year deal. But I think they would go to 2 years if they need to, and they really need to round out the rotation.
So one of the disturbing aspects of this season isn't just the inconsistency from a number of our players, but the fact that maybe our 3 most inconsistent players, Severino, Sanchez, and Bird, have all been viewed to this point, as cornerstones of our franchise moving forward, young guys that we could build around. And yeah, Sanchez got a few hits on Monday night. We'll see if it lasts, but his defense has been terrible, and honestly, it's tough to place a whole lot of faith in any of those 3 guys after this season. Now, assuming he's healthy, Severino will be in this rotation next year, but do you think the inconsistency with Sanchez and Bird, beyond inconsistency, really, they've both been historically bad to this point in the season, do you think Cashman could have a more active offseason than we might have thought, and maybe cut bait with, say, Sanchez or Bird, and maybe try to trade one or both of those guys and revamp this lineup?
I think you're definitely right about Severino. I think he's back. He's had his ups and downs, but, he's definitely back. He's safe. He's done enough. Bird and Sanchez, I don't see them trading them this offseason. I don't really see them giving up. I'll start with Sanchez. I definitely don't see them giving up on him because he's had a bad year, but, he's been good in every other year he's played in New York. So I think they definitely stick with him. He has such high potential. And then with Bird, I don't know if Luke Voigt is the complete answer at first base. I think Bird gets another opportunity next spring training. And for both of them, I think their value is so low right now, you wouldn't be getting a whole lot back on the trade market. So I think they're going to ride it out with those 2. I think Sanchez, I have much more confidence in him than I do Bird at this point. But I think Bird gets at least one more spring training to give it a shot at being the everyday first baseman.
So despite the fact that Sanchez had all offseason to work on the defense and didn't really improve, you still have faith that he can pull it together defensively?
Yeah, I also think that the offense is good enough where it can make up for, a little bit of the poor stuff defensively. But at the same time, Sanchez is pretty good with his pitchers. I know him and Severino lately have kind of had a few hiccups. They haven't really connected well. But for the most part, this year, Sanchez has been good with handling his pitchers. Maybe not blocking balls, maybe not, staying mentally aware in that sense behind the plate. But in terms of his connecting with his pitchers, calling a good game. I think he's been pretty good at that. So you hope he improves, and he has enough offensively when he's going to really make a difference behind the plate. So I think you give him a much longer leash than you do Bird at this point.
Now, Miguel Andujar has had a remarkable year offensively. I mean, currently hitting .298, OPS .852. That's elite for any player, but for a rookie, it's incredible. 40 doubles, 23 home runs. He's the first Yankee rookie since Joe DiMaggio back in '36 to pull that off. But the fact is, he's half a player. He's a really bad defensive third baseman right now. 15 errors on the season. That's the fourth worst in the majors. .942 fielding percentage. That's second worst in the majors. His range is not good. He has problems with glove transfers, and he doesn't make accurate throws. So, Danny, I know he's just 23, and he could definitely improve, but given the fact that the Yankees will likely be in the hunt for free agent Manny Machado this year, some people have thought of moving Andujar to first base. But to me, one of his assets, which is his strong arm, would be negated there. So I'm wondering if he could be more valuable in left field, where we currently have a declining Brett Gardner. So any thoughts on whether or not we could convert Andujar into a left fielder, maybe use Gardner as a fourth outfielder, and in doing so, open up a spot for Machado at third?
With Machado, you kind of take the same approach that you did with Stanton, where get the guy and figure it out later on. Those kind of talented guys and, next level players aren't available often. If you have the opportunity to get Machado, get him, and then, you can figure things out later. And I know they've talked about this first base and him going over there, trying that out. But left field, that's an interesting, it's definitely an interesting option because the Yankees do have, they do have Judge, they do have Gardner, they do have Stanton, they do have Hicks. But, hey, Andujar he's playing well enough where he definitely warrants a spot on this roster and a spot in the lineup. Hey, maybe in offseason he works out a little bit in left field. I mean, we've seen guys do that in the past, so crazier things have happened. But I really just think you get Machado and then figure everything else out afterwards. The biggest thing is to get the guy if you can.
Okay, Danny, I'll ask you our question from this week's mailbag that I'll answer a little later on in this podcast. Two veterans on this team, two good clubhouse guys, are the aforementioned Brett Gardner and CC Sabathia. Would you bring those two guys back next year, and why or why not?
I'll start with CC. I think if they can keep this up where they're doing this whole, CC's thinking about retiring, but they sign him to a one-year deal, and they just keep signing to one-year deals. I think this year he's shown that he's worth it. He's worth that one-year deal. You can never have enough starting pitching. I mean, we've seen all the injuries this year with, Montgomery and then Loaizaga and Herman in the rotation, and we've seen, the Yankees have real trouble filling out that rotation at times. So I think you definitely bring back CC if he wants to come back. He's not what he once was. He's not winning a Cy Young, but he's still a gamer. You still know you're confident when you throw him out there on the hill that he's going to give you, 5 gutsy innings at the very least. So I think him I would definitely bring back. But Gardner, on the other hand, I love him. He's been a great Yankee. He won a championship in 2009. But I think he's declining a little bit, and I think you have better options out in the outfield. With Judge and Stanton, definitely those two guys. They're going to be either DHing, playing right, playing left, wherever for the next, some odd years. But I also think they have Aaron Hicks one more year of arbitration with him, and I think at this point he's a much better option out there than Gardner. And in terms of keeping him as a fourth outfielder, I don't hate it, but I think maybe with Clint Frazier, perhaps he can get healthy in the offseason. I mean, you hope so. That's been, just terrible what's happened with him. But if he gets healthy in the offseason, he could be a fourth outfielder. And I'm not going to bring up Jacoby Ellsbury because who knows what to expect out of him anymore. But I think, unfortunately, it kind of looks like Brett Gardner's time with the Yankees is coming to an end.
It's funny you mentioned Ellsbury. I literally forgot he was on the team.
Yeah, that's the thing. I'm not going to say, oh, well, he's going to be the fourth outfielder or anything like that. But, he's on the roster somewhere, so he's always someone you forget about, but he could potentially play a role next season. you really never know.
Now, Gleyber Torres has had a hell of a year, and what's impressed me most of all, I think, and I think it's a great sign for the future, is his ability to weather that slump that he went through last month after his injury and come back strong. In the 18 games after he came off the DL, Gleyber hit just 152 with 20 strikeouts and 67 at-bats. Boone sits him for a game to kind of clear his head, and in the 21 games since then, he's hitting .351 with 5 homers and 16 RBIs. So, I mean, during that slump, and with all the time that Shohei Ohtani has missed this year, I was saying Andujar was a lock for Rookie of the Year, but do you think that Gleyber's recent resurgence has made this a real race between our second and third baseman for Rookie of the Year in the American League?
I think he has made it a race. I think early on I was thinking it was Torres, his to lose, and at that point that's when Andujar picked it up. He's been consistent all year. Torres has had his slump, like you said, but which you love to see him come out of it. But at the same time, I don't know if he's done enough to overtake Andujar for me at this point. So if I'm voting on it, I would go Andujar-Torres right now. But the thing I'm just going to say, which Yankee fans won't like, is I think Shohei Ohtani has a realistic chance at winning Rookie of the Year, which, Yankee fans are going to be all over Andujar and Torres or one of them, but I think Ohtani might end up taking it home. He wouldn't be my pick, but I wouldn't be surprised.
So why do you think Ohtani could still be in the mix?
My thing with Ohtani is that for a lot of people, we've never seen this before. We've never, for everyone. Unless you were alive to watch Babe Ruth, you never saw, the dual threat pitcher, hitter, guy who can play every day and start, once every 5 days in the rotation. I think still Andujar had the more impressive year, all things considered, but I think the fact that he's doing both might put him over the top for some people.
So Oakland is a lock to be our wild card opponent on October 3rd. Seattle's just fallen off the map, currently 7.5 games out of the wild card with just 19 games left to play. So looking at Oakland, fifth best offense in baseball, left fielder Chris Davis having a monster year, 41 home runs, 108 RBIs, third baseman Matt Chapman with a .363 on-base percentage, shortstop Marcus Semien with 148 hits, and in the OPS department, second baseman Jed Lowry and right fielder Stephen Piscotty, both over 800. Now, their pitching is shakier. Their ace, Sean Manaea, will have arthroscopic shoulder surgery next week. Brett Anderson also on the DL, and no one else in that rotation really scares you, although the acquisition of Mike Fiers from Detroit has certainly, been a net positive. But Danny, let's assume that we hang on to home field for that wild card game. Are you feeling pretty good about winning that game in the Bronx, assuming that we have Aaron Judge back and healthy?
I think I would say I feel about as good as you can going into a one-game wild card. Anything can happen. The best team in baseball could lose to the worst team in baseball on any given day, so there's always that. But the Yankees have the bullpen. You like them at home. They have the good lineup. So I would feel pretty confident going into it. Even if Severino isn't starting, he's not back. Even if it's Tanaka or Happ, I feel pretty confident going up against the Oakland A's starter.
Who would you go with for your starting pitcher in that game?
I'd probably go with Tanaka. His playoff performances last year, and right now he's just dealing every time he goes out. He's been with the Yankees, the longest out of at least the options to start Severino and Happ. So I think you go with the veteran Tanaka and let him see what he can do.
And would you start Austin Romine or Sanchez behind the plate?
I would go Sanchez behind the plate just to get the better lineup out there. And I think recently, the last couple times Sanchez has caught Tanaka, they've had pretty good connection. Sanchez hasn't been terrible behind the plate, so I think you just go with the better lineup and hope Sanchez rises to the occasion.
Okay, just a quick detour into the NFL, since I know you cover them as well on EliteSportsNY.com. Your general thoughts, Danny, on the Jets, who absolutely demolished the Lions last night in Detroit. First time in franchise history they scored 48 points or more in a regular season road game. And 21-year-old rookie quarterback Sam Darnold, after that first pick six on his very first NFL throw, really gathered himself and looked very composed. Great night for him. Jets defense was just smothering, 5 picks, and even the special teams stepped up. That surprised me. So did their performance on Monday night surprise you? And what do you expect from this team moving forward? Next game is at home on Sunday against Miami.
As a Jets fan, it's hard not to be surprised when they just completely go out and dominate. But obviously Darno is the story. He came out through that pick six and then bounced back, was very solid the rest of the way. But everything else about the team was good too. I mean, all three phases, like you said, the defense, they got the pick six, they completely shut down Stafford, the special teams, which, the Jets haven't had a good special teams in years, and then all of a sudden they're bringing punts back every time, they're getting great field position, and then, Darnold, just to get back to him, he's got weapons around him, very underrated guys like Quincy Enunwa, Robbie Anderson, so I think it's too easy to overreact after one big win against a Lions team that might not be very good. But we'll see the next 2 weeks. They've got winnable games against the Dolphins and the Browns. Let's see if they can keep it rolling, and we'll see how far they can go. But I don't want to overreact too much, but at the same time, it's impossible not to be excited after that.
I mean, with these next two winnable games against Miami and Cleveland, plus you got the Bills twice, who looked absolutely terrible on Sunday. In the AFC, it's very possible that a record of 8-8 could get you into the playoffs as a wild card. So do you think the Jets have at least an outside shot at a 500 record this year?
I wouldn't be shocked to see them sneak into the playoffs. I mean, like you said, the Bills, Dolphins, Browns, they have a couple other favorable games on their schedule. So, hey, we'll see. They're off to a good start, and they got to build on it next week. But so far, so good.
And the Giants, who lost, but, didn't exactly get blown out of the building by Jacksonville, who came very close last year to beating the Patriots in the AFC Championship game. But two offensive linemen, I thought, for the Giants were just terrible. Eric Flowers, no surprise. But big off-season acquisition Nate Solder also, and that was a surprise. Now, you did have some good runs from rookie running back Saquon Barkley, including that 73-yard touchdown run, and you had a nice performance from returning wideout Odell Beckham Jr. So, Danny, your thoughts on Giants Week 1 and their upcoming Sunday night matchup against the Cowboys at AT&T Stadium in Dallas?
The Jets, there's a reason to overreact a little bit, but with the Giants, there's no reason. The Jaguars are a really good team. That defense is excellent. You want more than 15 points. With the Giants, they're coming in with this highly touted offense. Saquon Barkley, Odell Beckham, Eli Manning. You want more than 15 points, but that might be the best defense they play all year. And Saquon, he was bottled up a little bit for the most part, but he did have that explosive run, that's his thing. He's going to have these, breakout games and these, ridiculously long runs. So, you expect him to maybe struggle a little bit at times, but you also expect to see those big runs. And OBJ, he's earning that contract so far. So we'll see how they bounce back next week against Dallas. Much more manageable game than going up against that tough Jaguars team.
Okay, final question, Danny. Getting back to the Yankees, what's been your biggest surprise from this team this year in a positive sense and a negative sense? And let's start with the negative.
Negatively, I would say going back to Gary Sanchez. We talked about him earlier. Him really not hitting at all this year. I know he's had his fair share of injuries, but he really just hasn't done much offensively. And I guess at this point, the hope is that he can turn it around and be a key guy on a postseason run. But, this year feels kind of like a lost year for Sanchez, who last year looked like he was going to be, perennial all-star year in, year out, best catcher in the American League. So he was definitely a disappointment.
Okay, and positive?
I have to go with Andujar. I mean, he's been, wire to wire. He's been so consistent. He's just been a guy that the team has actually leaned on at certain points where the lineup is struggling. He's just extra base hit after extra base hit. He's, hitting third, fourth, second in the lineup at times, right in the heart of the order. So I think the rookie Andujar coming out and just being so consistent was my biggest positive surprise.
Yeah, and Duhar has really been their most consistent hitter. All right, Danny, thanks so much for taking the time. We really appreciate it. And I'm a huge fan of your work, and all of our listeners should check out EliteSportsNY.com. Just incredible year-round coverage of all the New York teams. So, Danny, enjoy the stretch run. Keep up the good work, and we'll do it again soon, okay?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me on, Joe, and look forward to this stretch run, and definitely going to be listening to the Bronx Bomber podcast on the way down as the Yankees hopefully make a deep run.
All right, we'll come back. More Bronx Bombers in just a moment.
And now the answer to today's Bronx Bombers trivia question. Which player did Derek Jeter replace in 1996 to become the regular Yankee shortstop? The answer, D, Tony Fernandez. And now here's Joe with this week's Twitter poll.
Yes, this week's Twitter poll results are in. We asked you this. If Gary Sanchez continues to struggle, should the Yankees acquire a catcher this offseason to compete with him for the starting job? And 67% of our followers on Twitter at Bombers Podcast said no, he'll snap out of it. 22% said yes, we cannot rely on him. And 11% said start Austin Romine instead. So if you break that down, 2/3 of our respondents want to stick with Sanchez, and basically 1/3 find him unreliable. And as far as that third option, the start Romine option, I added that at the last second before I posted the poll, and it may sound crazy to some of you, but compared to Sanchez, who's been just abysmal on both sides of the plate all year, I mean, the dude's only played 75 games and he leads the league in passed balls, okay? And his average of 187, here's a stat for you. The only player in franchise history to have a lower average with 300 plus plate appearances was also a catcher, Red Kleinow, who hit 168 in 1908 for what were then called the New York Highlanders. So that's going back to, Teddy Roosevelt days. So it's getting to the point where even switching him to DH, that idea is losing its luster. The guy just is not hitting. He's had one good game since coming back from the DL. And Romine has had a much better year. They've played the exact same number of games, Romine and Sanchez. And Romine's hitting 248, Sanchez 187. Romine's on base is 306, Sanchez 281. Even slugging, where you expect, Sanchez to dominate, he has not. Romine's at 430, Sanchez at 414. Having said that, I don't like the idea of starting Romine next year necessarily. I think Austin Romine is a very serviceable backup catcher, better than serviceable actually. He's reliable defensively, and just looking at the American League, Romine's OPS, that's on base percentage plus slugging of 736, is far better than either of Boston's catchers, comparing favorably to Sandy Leon's 549 and Christian Vasquez at 559. Romine's 736 OPS is better than Houston's starting catcher Max Stassi at 729, just 7 points. But again, Romine's our backup, and his OPS is also superior to Houston's backup catcher, Brian McCann at 611. And looking at the Indians, whose starting catcher is Yan Gomes, Romine's only trailing his OPS by 4 points. And he has a much better OPS than their backup catcher, Roberto Perez. And looking at the final playoff team, his OPS is over 100 points higher than Oakland's starting catcher, Jonathan Lucroy, and much better than their backup, Josh Fegley. So Austin Romine is a really valuable member of this ball club, and pitchers like working with him. So it's not as crazy as it sounds to start him. I mean, offensively, he's right there with the starting catchers and some of the best teams in the American League. But I would favor bringing in a third guy to create some healthy competition for Sanchez and Romine. Lucroy will be a free agent, as will Yasmani Grandal of the Dodgers, who's having a very good year. Or, maybe the Yankees make a trade. And if all this sounds crazy to you, look, what happened with Greg Bird this year? The exact scenario I'm describing. He was given ample opportunity to prove he could contribute, and as I said since spring training, this was a make or break year for Bird, and he broke. And we brought in Luke Voigt and created that competition, and it worked out well. And Sanchez, and I know he has a lot of defenders. Every time I post something bad about Sanchez, they come after me. But the fact is, he's been worse than Bird. Worse. And we're paying him nothing. $620,000. We're paying Romine just over $1 million, which, considering the production I just laid out for Romine, that's a massive bargain. He's eligible for arbitration next year, so he'll probably get a raise, slight raise. But it's not like we owe either guy a huge chunk of change. So I think you look at the Bird situation that just unfolded as a template. You get some competition in there, a guy that can give us, at least what Romine can give us with the bat, but more importantly, be reliable defensively. And you see what happens, because as I said on Twitter last week, it's not that Sanchez is a bad major league catcher. I honestly don't think he is a major league league catcher at all. A position which by definition requires those who fill it to be able to catch the ball. The guy had all off season to work on it after his much publicized struggles last year. Boone said he looked dynamite in spring training. There was no improvement. He also, he gets sent down with his second groin injury of the year, which is another problem. He cannot stay healthy. So his second groin injury, after a horrendous display of laziness in that game in Tampa, where he let a guy score from second base on a pass ball and then failed to run hard out of the box on what turned out to be the final out of that loss. And after that, after that trip to the DL, Boone says, yeah, he looks phenomenal. He lost all this weight, blah, blah, blah. So motivated. He comes back, and in a single inning, one of the most atrocious defensive innings I have ever seen, allows 2 passed balls against the A's and 2 wild pitches, all in the same inning. One of those wild pitches, by the way, should have been ruled a pass ball. So for all of you who think he's going to somehow come out of it after, an entire offseason to work on his defense, think again. Mark my words, by 2020 at the latest, Gary Sanchez will not be a major league catcher. And if he is, he'll still lead the league in pass balls. I'm telling you, this guy, he's a liability back there. So in conclusion, I don't think starting Romine next year is the craziest idea in the world, but what I would like to do is bring in some healthy competition for the starting job with a third guy in the mix. And if that third guy shines like Luke Voigt has at first base and Sanchez loses that competition, then so be it. We'll be a better ball club for it. All right, from this week's mailbag, our question of the week here on Bronx Bombers comes from Jake in New Zealand. And by the way, the email is joe@bronxbomberspodcast.com, or you can find us on Twitter @BombersPodcast is the handle, or give us a call at 646-854-4959. If you have any questions you want to have us answer on any future episodes, we are more than happy to do so. And Jake writes, would you re-sign Sabathia and Gardner next year? I feel that CC's on borrowed time with his knee and generally seems out of shape. Gardy's clearly a big part of the team culture, and I don't doubt his efforts, so perhaps he could be worth the $12.5 million option for next year. Well, thanks for that question, Jake. It's a good one, and those two guys are known as clubhouse leaders. Gardy has been with the team since 2008, Sabathia since 2009. Those two guys, along with David Robertson, are the only current Yankees that were on that 2009 championship roster. So before I give you my answer, let's clarify the contract status for each player. As Jake mentioned, the Yankees have a $12.5 million team option on Gardner next year. That was part of the extension he signed in spring training back in 2014, and the Yankees have that option against a $2 million buyout. So if the team chooses not to exercise that option and pay him $12.5 million next year, they basically pay him $2 million to go away. And by the way, since Gardner now has 10 years of major league service time, he has veto power over any trade. Now, the contract status for Sabathia is much more simple. When the season ends, he's an unrestricted free agent, as he was at the end of last season. His $10 million contract is just for this year. So let's start there. As I've said many times over the past few weeks, the absolute primary mission for Brian Cashman this offseason must be to attack our pitching rotation head on. He needs to aggressively reconstruct this rotation. I think the bullpen also has its problems. I think he'll tweak that as well. We certainly have had fall off from Tommy Canley, who's been horrible, and Chad Green to a lesser extent. A.J. Cole fell off the map. But remember, we've had so many 5, 4, even 3-inning starts this year. I mean, Severino had one just last week in Oakland. Sonny Gray had yet another one on Tuesday in Minnesota. So over the course of a long season, that's bound to tax the bullpen. But Sabathia, with that terrible start last week in Oakland, failed to do what he did throughout 2017, and that was be the Yankees stopper after a loss. He appears, as Jake said, to be running out of gas. So looking ahead to next year, two guys guaranteed to be in this rotation are hopefully healthy Severino and Tanaka. But here's the problem. We have no idea what's going on with Luis Severino and whether or not he'll be able to regain his form. No clue what's going on there. So at present, we do not have an ace. And the truth is, most World Series champions have two. And so if it was up to me, I'd re-sign Jay Happ, who other than one start has been phenomenal in New York. And I'd also go after Patrick Corbin of Arizona, who's pitched to a 2.99 ERA in Arizona with a 1.007 whip. So neither of those guys are exactly Jacob deGrom, but who is, right? And if you get those two guys with Severino and Tanaka, that's, to me, is a nice start. But again, Tanaka over the course of the year has been fairly inconsistent, and Severino since mid-July has been one of the worst pitchers in the American League with an ERA over 7. So even with Happ and Corbin, you've got uncertainty with two guys, Tanaka and Severino. Do you really want to throw in a third guy in Sabathia that you don't know if you can rely on? I would not. So, Jake, I would pass on Sabathia and actually try to go after a third guy at the Happ-Corbin level or close, and it would probably have to be a trade. The list of pitcher free agents this offseason is less than inspiring, unless you want to take a gamble on Charlie Morton. But I feel like if there's one area where Cashman is vulnerable to some criticism, it's that he's too focused on power and has neglected pitching and defense over the past few years. And I think when it comes to our 2019 rotation, the attitude absolutely cannot be, well, let's save a few bucks and, settle for less. Maybe it'll work out. We've had too many years now of a rotation chock full of question marks, and with Severino's status unclear and Tanaka, who again has been great recently, but over the course of the season has been somewhat inconsistent with a 3.61 ERA, it's time to stock up on talented arms. So no, Jake, I would not re-sign Sabathia. I think his halcyon days are over. Now, the Gardner question is more difficult to answer. It would be less difficult if we had a healthier Clint Frazier, chomping at the bit, but his season was shut down due to post-concussion migraines, so there's another fluid situation where you just don't know if you can rely on him as an option. You have to see how his health plays out. And, let's face it, this year has been yet another where Gardner has faded in the second half. And yes, he's 35 years of age, but honestly, he's kind of done that throughout his career, faded in the second half. But in the 44 games since the All-Star break, Gardner has been just awful at the plate, hitting 205, 286 on base, which is just abysmal for anyone, but especially for a leadoff hitter, which is why Boone dropped him in the order, and zero power. So offensively, he's been a dead weight on this lineup for months now, striking out a ton, which with all the strikeouts from Stanton and Sanchez and others, Stanton has 195, just him. That's insane. So Gardner, who in the past could be relied upon to be a tough out, has been anything but recently. Now, I do expect him to be a valuable member of this team in the playoffs if we get past Oakland. We saw him step up last year in the playoffs, especially in that division series against Cleveland, and I think the clubhouse presence thing is real. I've read quotes from multiple Yankee players and coaches that he's always helping out younger players with their mental approach, and he's always helping to make newcomers feel welcome. That's great. And defensively, he's certainly an above-average outfielder, patrolling left field with a center fielder's speed. That's an asset as well, and he's a good base runner. But looking at our potential roster next year, we talked about Sanchez just a minute ago. Personally, I have zero faith that he'll ever be an adequate major league catcher, which means if he doesn't improve defensively, but his bat comes around, which is possible, then maybe, Sanchez sees more time at DH next year, and that would force Stanton to play more outfield. So then the question becomes, do you want to pay Gardner $12.5 million to be a fourth outfielder? And then, of course, there's always the possibility of a big free agent signing like Bryce Harper, which I'm hoping Cashman doesn't do, but that would likely push Gardner out of his starting role as well. So I'm just kind of presenting here the muddy waters we're looking at as far as the Gardner situation with myriad unknowns here in September. But I'll put it this way, Jake. If Gardner contributes once again in the playoffs this year, assuming that we even make it, and again, I don't consider a one-and-done wild card game the playoffs. That's a play-in game, not a playoff game. But if we get into the ALDS and hopefully beyond, and Gardner contributes, I think his defense and veteran leadership could justify one more year if, and this is a big if Cashman does the right thing and attacks this rotation issue head on this winter. But I'm not entirely comfortable with Gardner as our go-to go-to starting left fielder next year, considering how badly he's been falling off in the second half. So if we do pick up that option, I think it should be more as a fourth outfielder, and the Yankees need to come up with an option either internally or externally that can give us some more offensive production than he has. So in short, Sabathia no, Gardner yes, but only if Gardner's role is reduced to essentially a fourth outfielder. But thanks, Jake. That's a great question, and thanks for tuning in from all the way out there in New Zealand where it's still winter. I mean, that's far away. It's nice to know that the Bronx Bombers podcast has fans 9,000 miles away, so that's a great job. And that'll do it for this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. Again, don't forget, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. Find us on Spotify. Follow us on Twitter @BombersPodcast is the handle. Like us on Facebook as well. But most of all, have faith in the Yankees. We'll see you again next week.